he's here all week. eat the fish. Believe me, I've been doing this for a long time. There's no better way to bring a room down than to introduce the professor. That's why I don't even talk about that part of my life. It's much more exciting to talk about your lives because among all of the events that we do, this has quickly become among my favorites. The sheer excitement that you guys have, the direct-to-consumer brands have about your product is really so energizing. The biggest problem I have as a programmer is just getting you all here for 3 days because you're so busy. From there, I just let you guys go and make sure the wheels don't come off. But there are some fascinating things about this stage that we're at when it comes to direct-to-consumer brands and the revival of the idea of the brand. Because remember, we have been in a moment, especially in the last 10 years, where we've seen a real erosion of support and loyalty and thinking about the brand. The Havas famous brand trust study has found again and again that more than half of us could care less if 70% of our brands went away tomorrow. That ennui, really, remember, brands started over a century and a half ago. Branding was in the late 19th century. It was a function of mass production and distribution. As the sourcing of products no longer became local, but went national and international and cross-country, we needed brands to assure us both of quality and even safety. And as mass production and consumer capitalism kicked in and advertising in the 1920s, brand became that key differentiator. We needed this idea. But as digital channels, along with everything else over the last 20, 30 years, have eroded a lot of that feeling of trust and identification with brands. We have really seen a commoditization across the channels. So, for instance, let me call up my first slide as a good example of this. This is a recent survey of growth by business sector. We are really in a trough of growth across the board, across many business categories, and part of that has to do with devotion to brand and identification with brand. One of the things that you guys did as a group, the direct-to-consumer brands over the last few years, is really put the lie to this idea that brand is dead. In fact, one of the things that you've demonstrated is that consumers still want to align their own sense of values, their own sense of status, their own sense of identity with products and with companies that they think represent them. The idea of consumer culture is still alive and well, but it needs to be rethought. It needs to be redefined. And that, I think, is what's exciting about a lot of what you guys are doing. But we've come to a point where we've proven that brands are not dead, but we still need to understand what's that next stage. How does all of this stay at scale? How does this sustain? A lot of you have proven yourselves, particularly in idiosyncratic and specific products that have spoken to a niche market, but does this scale? Does this get bigger? And that's what this event is all about. Growth is the main challenge for every category now, including all of you. Except for health and tech, most product categories are seeing either low single-digit or negative growth. And we're going to be, that's what this edition of the D2C Summit is really about, is exploring that next stage of sustainability. We know that D2Cs have cracked the code around brand blindness, around boredom, and indifference to brands, but can they crack the code of long-term growth? And that's one of the things that we'll be talking about across a lot of topics over the next few days. Growth through brand expansion and new product development. We'll be talking about that especially tomorrow. Through CRM and deepening relationships with users. We're going to be hearing a lot about LTV over the next few days, I think. As well as discussions about internal organization and partnering out of house. We'll be talking about that especially on the third day. But we start, as we do with all of these events, with you guys. As many of you know, I start these events with a survey of the brands themselves and where they are and where you guys are in the process and what your thinking is. And that's where I want to start now with some of the answers to a series of questions that I sent out just a few days ago. So pardon the roughness of some of these slides. We will be posting them online. I'll be using some of them tomorrow as well. But I surveyed all of you about some of the sets of attitudes, concerns, and challenges that you're working with as you come into this event. So I asked in particular in the past year, what's been the biggest change and challenge to your marketing plan? And overwhelmingly, as sort of we predicted by just the way in which we crafted this agenda, it's cost. Cost of acquisition has been going up. In many ways, some of you guys caused that rising cost. As you started dumping more and more VC money into the channels, we started seeing CPCs and CPMs rising precipitously. But the ways in which a lot of you are citing rising costs at Facebook, rising costs across the social channels, and the ways in which you're trying to deal with that. Also, the ways in which a lot of you are trying to reach new customers through new channels. That's going to be a conversation that we'll be having over the next few days. We'll be talking about really new and interesting channels, especially podcasting. We've been talking about home shopping network and what that adds to the equation. But we'll be talking a lot about the ways in which money in the marketing mix is moving across different channels. But also that raises the question of how does this marketing mix work? Things like attribution and the ways in which all of these different channels work together. And of particular importance, and the thing that came up in a lot of the responses to this survey, was the ways in which there's an unevenness of data across those channels, where a lot of you starting on social channels that were delivering a lot of performance data that was fairly granular are now finding as you're moving across into other channels, especially things like OTT, podcasting, a lot of others, they're just not returning that level of data anymore. This is another interesting point I'll be looking for over the next few days. A lot of you are disruptors who are now being disrupted. You entered into categories that you defined new categories often with either new products or new takes on old product lines, and now you're finding that you yourselves, or the category is starting to get commoditized by other competitors. And that's an interesting challenge that you all need to meet, especially how you convince people your product is better and that you represent the real thing. I also asked about what's your biggest challenge in maintaining or growing the pace of customer acquisition, and again, a lot of it had to do with the growing cost of social, the higher CPMs and CPCs, especially in Facebook, but also the ways in which you're starting to look into a lot of other channels and trying to understand how they work and how they can deliver back data. And again, we'll be posting all of these and covering these at MediaPost after the fact. So this whole deck, there are 28 slides altogether. I'm going to move very quickly through only half of these today. But all of these will be available online so you can go back and reference them. And again, the idea of one of the things that's interesting that also came up in these is the ways in which brand building itself is now becoming more and more important. That bottom line growth and customer acquisition is now starting to morph into wider thinking about what's the relationship between brand building and the cost of brand building and how that impacts overall customer growth. And then I think interesting the ways in which now the supply chain itself, the direct-to-consumer supply chain itself, has become more complex. As some of you are now moving into retail, partnering increasingly with e-commerce partners like Amazon, with affiliate marketing, the ways in which the supply chain that had been so simplified by direct-to-consumer is now being complicated by all of these other relationships. And again, rising CPAs, and also, again, a term that I think we're going to be hearing a lot about is the ways in which people are starting to choose channels more based and thinking more about overall lifetime value of customers rather than sheer bottom line growth. And finally, just for today, I wanted to talk about, since we're talking a lot about growth, how each of you is defining growth. And it was fascinating to me in looking at this about how you're all defining growth. Many of you sort of starting overall customer acquisition, growth of membership, but also other metrics that are starting to seep in. Not only top line revenue growth, but also things like growth per product and from channel and changes from channel to channel. Also, how you're growing within a particular category and the ways in which you're comparing to category and starting to measure yourself over against competitors. But also, overall, another thing that came up a lot is average order value. And I think this is something we're going to hear and see in a bunch of sessions over the next few days, is deepening the customer relationship, extracting more value from that relationship, not only an average average order value, but also in lifetime value of the customer. And again, here's an interesting example of the sort of the range of things like people are starting to measure now, things like brand engagement, again, measuring up against against your category, growing membership subscribers because that deepens overall revenue and repeatable revenue. Anyway, these are just a few of the things that I wanted to mention here that you were giving us feedback on and the ways in which you were defining the challenges that you were seeing. This summit is all about you. It's all about you sharing these perspectives and sharing these ideas. And I wanted to, just for those of you who are new to the summit, how many of you have never been to a MediaPost summit before? All right. Just a few basic rules about how this works and how to extract the most out of the summit. Everything that we do on stage, because we're MediaPost, we're the largest publisher of media and marketing news in the US, everything on stage is on the record. We're live streaming it over MediaPost, so if you've got people back at the home office, you want to ping to tune in, they can go to MediaPost.com and get the link to the live stream. We'll also be posting the videos afterwards back on the agenda, so you can go back and reference these sessions. But then when we come at noon, when we end the onstage portion, we move into the roundtables. And that's all off the record. Everything off stage at a MediaPost event is off the record. There are some of us who are editors and journalists who are here. We won't report on anything unless anybody gives us specific permission to. The roundtables are really the heart of this summit. I can't stress enough that the content on stage becomes conversations that energize and fuel the rest of the day here, even when you're off playing golf or doing brewery tours or wine tasting or out doing kayaking. So spend the time, don't go off and grab and take the phone meeting at noon, but spend the time and invest them in the roundtables. Those discussions really will energize the day. So please